Online for Authors. I'm chatting with Sean Pauzauskie, author of Stage of Fools. Welcome, Sean.
Thank you so much, Terry. Great to be here.
I'm excited to have you. It was a very interesting book. But before we dive in, can you give listeners a quick idea of what they're going to find when they open up the cover of Stage of Fools?
Yeah. So what you're going to find when you open up the cover of Stage of Fools is a novel that is telling a classic story in a modern way that is asking the question, what does it mean to be human in this rapidly emerging age of neurotechnology?
Wow. And if that doesn't sum it up very cleanly, I'm curious what genre you consider Stage of Fools, because when I'm reading it, it like fits a lot of semi-categories and I had trouble actually pinpointing it. What do you consider it?
So I like the term science-informed literary fiction. I know that the cross-genre approach is going to, confuse a lot of bookstores, and like I think when I had it placed on the first shelves, they put it under sci-fi fantasy, which is totally okay. There's elements
Right.
of science, but I always like the science to serve the humanity first, and so that's why I kind of like the term science-informed literary fiction.
Fantastic. Now, my next question is when you were writing it, did you have that term in mind, or did you write it and then say, oh, now I have to market it? What am I calling it?
Yeah, I think that I knew that it wasn't going to fit cleanly. To your point, I think that's a very
Yeah,
perceptive point. Is like I knew it wasn't going to cleanly fit, but just for the marketing perspective, I was comfortable with it kind of fitting in multiple categories, and
right,
wherever people want to put it is fine, as long as people are enjoying it and reading it and getting
right.
something out of it.
Right. I have found recently, in particular, I think because there's a lot more self-publishing going on, a lot more small press publishing going on, a lot more digital books being available, that these really well-defined genres are starting to leak. And they're not that anymore. I just spoke with someone who did a speculative historical fiction. Like those
Wow,
kinds of
yeah.
things didn't even exist 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Those didn't happen. And so I really do like this idea that you're able to say, no, my book is science informed literary fiction. And it's like, people are going to be like, what is that? And that's the cool thing, is authors aren't being required to stay in those narrow bounds anymore.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that's one of the beauties and one of the real beauties of the direction that the publishing industry has gone, is that everything doesn't have to fit cleanly into, this is a Western, this is a
Right.
sci-fi, and this is literary. We can kind of play with the ingredients and kind of, make a new soup out of all of that.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. Where did the idea come from for this book?
So this is an idea that had kind of been percolating for some time and then kind of came to me all at once. So I'm a practicing neurologist that's my day job. I see patients in the hospital, but I was a lit major. I was an English major in college, and so I always plan to write. And so this book is kind of the union of those two worlds, where when I started out in my career, I take care of patients in the hospital, and some of the earliest consults that I would get from the other hospital doctors is what's going to happen to this patient in a coma. And I quickly realized, like, oh wow, like that's such an intense and important time and topic and condition that you really want to have the best answer that you can possibly have. And so I found myself really thinking on that hard and reading all the literature, and I came across this relatively new understanding of patients in coma, in a condition that is called cognitive motor dissociation, or CMD. And what that means is that for centuries we thought that patients in coma just had no element of consciousness, like they're just by
Right.
definition they're unconscious. And then about 20 years ago, some scientists and researchers, some clever scientists, decided to start asking questions with some of this new technology, where we could actually see what's going on inside of the brains of these patients, and then ask questions about whether that assumption was really true or not. And sure enough, just like a lot of great scientific discoveries, we were surprised to learn that the answer is actually some of these patients, up to a quarter of them actually, about 25%, have some degree of preserved awareness, can hear what's going on in the room, and not only hear what's going on, but respond meaningfully. And so I was just kind of, even as a professional, neurologist, I was just kind of shocked, and I thought, well, there's something there. But the novel wasn't quite there yet for the first, couple of years. But as I went along and I wrote, a couple novels, and I wrote some historical fiction. But then I really got to thinking about, what would be a good topic for a novel that would combine neuroscience and neurology with literature. And then the idea just came to me to write,
Yeah.
King Lear in a coma. So that's kind of the long
Right.
story of how it came together.
No, and I love that, because that's what happens to me sometimes. It's like I'll read an article and I'll think, oh, that is interesting information. What am I going to do with that? How am I going to turn that into a story? So I
Yeah.
like that a lot. So as a neurologist, then, I'm assuming that this is pretty accurate in terms of what your patient in this story is thinking, feeling, understanding about life going on around him.
Yeah. So I really tried to, take that subversive notion of consciousness in a coma and then turn it into something that is kind of speculative in a way, in the sense that, I don't know that we have complete narratives of patients who are in
Yeah,
comatose states, but
right.
certainly reports that, yeah, so the whole idea of a novel is kind of expansive on that notion, really to raise awareness and, provide people with some kind of context or lens to really look at coma patients, freshly, and anew. But the story itself, I think the first problem that I like when I had that notion to write a novel, it was like, gosh, how's there going to be any action? How's there going to be any tension? How's there going to
Right.
be,
Yeah,
the
they're
character?
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Like how is there going to be a story? And so I actually took an idea that I really liked, that I kind of decided to mirror in a way, and that was that the author Ian McEwan, who wrote the book Atonement, that was made into the movie in the late 2000s, really really wonderful, and one of my favorite writers, had written. A book called Nutshell, I think was actually the sequel to Atonement. And he told the story of Hamlet from the perspective of an unborn child. And I thought, well, if that can be done, an unborn baby listening to Hamlet, then what's the natural analogy is, somewhat older character listening to the plot of King Lear unfold in the ICU, was how that came together.
Yeah. So that was going to be one of my questions, was like, why King Lear? I'm curious, is that one that you liked and that's why it came to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it made sense in that, I think my best one of my best mentors as an undergraduate was my Shakespeare professor. Like he really
Okay.
taught me a lot about not just Shakespeare, but how to write a clean sentence. All the kind of like
Right.
grammar rules and kind of the very for my own benefit, kind of strict in that sense.
Right.
And I love this mentor that I had. His name's David Bergeron. Was at the University of Kansas, and so Shakespeare has always kind of been somewhere in the background of everything that I sort of do. And so King Lear was one of the plays that I read in college, and I knew about it. I knew the basic plot and underpinnings, but
Right.
it was one that I think that maybe I wanted to go a little bit deeper into personally, just kind of like get into the nuts and bolts of what is King Lear. And then also I just thought it made sense from the perspective of the plot, being an older character at the end, because the book sits in the middle of a trilogy, and at the end of part one, this kind of older character falls into a coma, and so it just kind of like made sense to start with King Lear, and so kind of for
Right.
those two reasons. Mhm.
Okay. Awesome. Awesome. I didn't catch the King Lear right away, and then all of a sudden it was like, oh, I see what's happening here. And I don't know if I was being slow. I think sometimes I've got so many things going on, I don't take as much time with the reading. I'm reading them and I'm enjoying them, but I'm kind of like glossing. And then it's all of a sudden like, wait a minute, what's going on here? I'm missing something. So I found that really, really interesting that you did that. I don't want to give things away, so we're not going to dive deep into this, but there are some scenes where they're trying some new technologies for reversing coma patients, getting them out of the coma. And I'm curious if those kinds of technologies actually exist, or if that was more of a speculative portion of this book.
Yeah. So that was kind of the natural antecedent of, first, how do you have a plot, with a character in a coma,
Right.
and then how might that plot have any kind of turning point or any kind of twist? And sure enough, just kind of like almost by serendipity, I came across this paper that came out of, I think it was UCLA, in 2016, and they were actually doing this, and they were actually able to wake a few patients up using this technology. It's called focused ultrasound, or like the same ultrasound that you might use to, look at an organ inside or look at a
Okay.
baby,
Right.
in utero, but with a different, like a high intensity frequency that can stimulate different structures in the brain. And so what they did is they took this ultrasound and they focused it on this structure deep in the brain called the thalamus. And so the term that gets used is ultrasonic thalamic stimulation.
Okay.
And we've learned all sorts of things about the thalamus over time, but it's kind of surprisingly, again, it's very important in terms of keeping us awake and kind of integrating all of our neural processes. Like it's kind of like a crossroads for many different things, but one of them being consciousness. But to answer your question, yes, this is actually a real technology
Wow, that's
that
cool.
yeah, it kind of blew me away. Just like how is this even possible?
Right.
But it actually happens, and I actually have an interest myself in maybe even possibly doing some of these studies in the future, even though right now it should be noted, and I don't want anyone to think that this is like the standard of care, or like
Right.
this is something that you could go out and ask for today or tomorrow, because the neurotechnology is part of the speculative, kind of like the fiction part of the science fiction, within the broader narrative.
Right.
um,
Yeah, I'm always very intrigued when I'm writing and I find something that is going to be the thing that helps me move my plot along. You're doing the research and all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, this exists. This is what I'm going to use. And so the fact that you do that in your own field, I think is fabulous. Here you are, a neurologist, and you're doing research and finding things that you didn't know about that actually are going to help your story go forward as well, which
Yeah. I think sometimes what I think I've learned over the years is that you don't always have to reinvent the wheel. Like sometimes things just
yeah,
come to you, and it's like, hey, like that's actually real. That's actually happening. Like, yeah, let's explore that.
let's go ahead and do that. Let's talk a little bit about research because I would have assumed that you didn't need to do very much at all because you've got a patient who is in a coma. You deal with patients in comas. What kind of research did you have to do in order to get this book to come out the way it did?
Yeah. So I would say that, and that's a great question. I would say that um, probably the heaviest lift on the research um, was the neurotechnology and the scientific elements of like really diving in and being sure, like, because I know it's a subversive notion that, hey, patients are in a coma, like let's make sure that this is actually a real thing. And
Right,
so kind of really doubling down on that, because I don't want people to think that here's just like this random speculative thing that's just made up. So
right, right.
really, yeah. So really doing diligence on that, and then the ultrasonic thalamic stimulation. I wanted to make sure that was sound as well. But really, a lot of the plot, like I think a lot of writers, it's kind of an amalgamation of experience, imagination, maybe some reading. So I felt like you know getting things together into the soup, that we're talking about,
Yeah.
was really a process of both past experience, and then the heavier lift being on kind of like the neurotech and the science side.
Okay. And I know there was a portion of the book where we're in Alaska and we're dealing with pipeline stuff. Did you already know about that, or was that some more research that you had to do?
So that is actually, no, that's a good point. Is that I did do some research on that as well.
Okay.
I was actually born in Anchorage,
Okay.
and so I didn't quite grow up there. Like I moved out when I was just getting ready to start school, but my family would go back every year, and we had tons of friends, and it was like just kind of the place I went in the summer times, and I was born there, so it's very familiar. I actually had some encounters with I don't want to give too much away, but there are some bears in there, and
There's some
so.
bears.
Yeah, which you're going to find in Alaska,
Right.
um, but the pipeline, that was also an element where I was like, okay, let's make this as true to form. And like I knew about the pipeline coming down from the northern part of the state all the way down, and so to kind of give I don't want to give too much away of the plot
Right.
either, but there's an element of characters who have to succeed in business, and so I wanted to make sure that was at least as true as possible. But no, I don't have any personal connection to the
Okay.
oil industry or anything
Yeah.
like that.
You always just wonder because they always tell you write what you know, and you did that, to a degree, but then there are these other things thrown in. And so when people tell me to write what I know, I always say, well, that would be boring, because, who wants to just hear about a 62-year-old woman who's a grandma? Like, there's not a lot to talk about. So I always write what I know in terms of character, feeling, and emotion. I'm very
Yes.
empathetic, and I understand, and I've been through some trauma type things, and I get that, and that's what I write about. But then I often put them places that I know nothing about, and that's where my research comes in.
Yeah, that's a
So
great way of putting it. Yeah, and
yeah,
that's kind of like what we started talking about. Like I like the emotional core of the novel to remain intact and be the driver, because ultimately I think that's why we read, is
right,
that maybe we want to take a perspective of somebody who has a completely different experience that we do, and maybe we try to write that at times, and we write things that we are interested in, and we want to kind of place things in that context. But no, to your point, absolutely. Like everyone has something to write about that is sort of like the emotional arc of the life, and so there's definitely an element of that too.
absolutely. Other than the main character, were there other characters that you really enjoyed, and that you're glad that you were able to write and put into the book?
Yeah, yeah. So I think that kind of going back to just the structural choices of the character in a coma, like, and told in the first person, by the way,
Right.
so
Yep.
it's like you're going to be getting a lot of first person perspective from a character in a coma, and so everything is kind of told through the lens of their eyes. But yeah, I think that when I looked at King Lear and I saw all the different and in the front near the front cover of the book, there's a dramatis personae. That was actually an idea that my wife had. It's a great idea, to kind of take King Lear and make it this you know cast of characters, so to speak.
Right.
But the Earl of Gloucester is sort of like the character that when Lear is just kind of like Lear doesn't quite realize just how badly he's judging everyone kind of in his orbit, and
Right.
Gloucester's loyal to him, but he thinks that he's not. And so kind of that tension between, and in Stage of Fools in the novel, I made the Earl of Gloucester a character named Dr. Glower, just to kind of have the phonetics be similar. And so I would say I enjoyed that character because of that tension, sort of like, here's this character in a coma and he's got these doctors coming by, and like how he relates to them, and they're trying to help him, but he doesn't quite appreciate it. And so like I found that to be kind of an enjoyable, a narrative arc to write.
Yeah, yeah, and I often like some of my side characters, and sometimes they try really hard to become a little bigger than I intended them to be. So I always like asking about that. Do you consider yourself a plotter or a pantser?
I'm sorry, a plotter or a
A pantser, someone who writes by the seat of their pants. Like, do you like to have
oh
it all plotted out, or do you just kind of write very organically and see where it goes?
Yeah, so I found this formula to work very well for me personally. I know everybody's different and has like
Yeah.
whatever works for you is the right answer, but I find myself being a little bit of both, actually.
Okay.
I don't really start writing a story until I know kind of the main points, like the main characters and the main plot points. Like I probably couldn't have written this without knowing about the ultrasonic dynamic stimulation,
Okay.
because
Okay.
it's like, how is this going to build to any kind of action or tension? But between points, so like I always know the opening. I know a few of the main kind of drivers of the plot in the middle, like where maybe a sudden change happens, and I don't want to give anything away, but
Right. No,
I'm
don't. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, but I always like to have that kind of large structural sense, and then I like to work my way from point to point with an organic kind of free. Like when I sit down at my desk every morning to write, I don't know what's going to happen, but I kind of know sort of where I'm headed, and then I know once I get there, it's kind of like maybe mountain climbing in a way. Like
Okay,
like
like
okay,
like where you're putting the spike, but you don't know necessarily how you're getting from here to that spike, right?
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So it kind of
Okay.
keeps it fresh, but I stay oriented, but it kind of keeps it fresh. Yeah.
All right. All right. Um, when someone's done with this book and they walk away, other than a great story, what do you hope they walk away with?
Um, yeah, so I hope that they walk away maybe with a little bit better understanding of King Lear, or at least, if you didn't know King Lear before, like maybe you've got a slightly better sense. But that's just in a plot kind of historical context with Shakespeare. I really hope that people come away with some notion of consciousness and what it is, and what it is to them. Because I don't want to give away too many specifics, and I feel like I keep saying that, but the point being that um, it's meant to be a kind of a meditation on consciousness throughout. And so I'll just kind of leave it at that. Like,
Okay.
um, what is consciousness if it's possible in the state of coma? And so I hope that people kind of emerge, like kind of like the things that I like my favorite books do for me is like I feel like they help me feel something. But maybe they made me think a little bit.
Yeah.
So maybe a little bit of both. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it definitely has left me thinking about coma patients. What does that mean? Like, so this is just now, like the question just came to me. As a neurologist, if you've got a patient in a coma, can you know whether or not they fit that 25% and they're conscious?
So the short answer is yes, but we're not there yet in terms of
Okay.
the infrastructure. And so this is kind of like one thing that I view as part of my day job goals, over the course of my career, maybe over the next 20, 25 years, is that by the time I retire as a physician, as a neurologist, it's not just that there are patients in comas, but what type of coma are they in? And do we know? And the reason for that, I'm really glad that you brought that up, because one of the things about this cognitive motor dissociation is that we know that it confers a 7 times more likely chance of a good recovery after the coma.
Oh,
So if we can find these 25% of people, and if it's my family member, or if it's me someday,
right.
I would want people to know that there's this chance by identifying that cognitive motor dissociation. And maybe just to get into a little bit of the weeds on, but not too much, about the science. A lot of the initial studies for this condition were done with these big bulky machines that might fill up half a room, and you're never going to get that by the bedside. But we're getting to the point where you can hook up something called an EEG, or an
Right.
electroencephalogram, just reading electrical activity of the brain, and with pretty good fidelity using AI. This is one of the benefits of AI that's bringing to clinical neurology, identify these patients who are in that coma at the bedside. So, but the short answer to your question is yes,
Not
but we're not
yet.
not yet. Yeah.
Not quite yet. That's really interesting about AI. I think so many people are so dead set against it. I don't like AI. And it's like, yeah, it's how is it used?
Hmm.
And it's to me, it's like any technology. Any technology can be used poorly and
Exactly.
and has been used poorly. But
Exactly.
it can also be used for unbelievable benefit.
Yes, exactly. And that's just, I mean, you're like taking the words right out of my mouth about this neurotechnology, that this book kind of sits at the centerpiece of this neurotechnology trilogy. That this is there are broadly two types of neurotechnology: the kind that can read brain activity, like what we're talking about with the
Right.
telling if patients are in a coma. But this one kind of dives into stimulating the brain, as we've talked about, and that's the second type, is stimulating brain activity. And then the third part is going to be kind of going deeper in, like, beneath the skull, with these implants and devices that may do both, like read brain activity and stimulate it at the same time. But absolutely, to your point, and that's one of the reasons that I feel like there's kind of like a blurry line between my day job and the writing, is that I really want to raise awareness about neurotechnology.
Yeah.
These things that are going to change how we understand ourselves, how our capabilities, like we may go beyond certain capabilities we've never had before. But to your point, absolutely, it's all how you use it that determines, like, is this a
Yeah.
good or bad kind of use of the technology.
Right. Right. Absolutely. I want you to tell me a little bit about what you're writing next. So you say this is part of a trilogy. What was the first one called? We've got Stage of Fools, and then what's coming up?
Yeah, no. So thanks for asking. So the first one is called A Savage and Beautiful Season, or
Okay.
that's the working title. I'm kind of I've got a few kind of decisions to make about which direction to go with that one, but it should be out sometime in the next couple years.
Okay.
And then the third one, I'm calling it kind of the reading, writing, and arithmetic of the neurotechnology. So part one is reading. The Stage of Fools is the writing, and then the third one's going to be the arithmetic, where we go beneath, like, into the brain, and kind of it all comes together, and kind of like you could think of it like the Neuralink. Like, everyone kind of knows what Neuralink
Yeah.
is,
Yeah.
like doing these implants. But so I'm writing the third part right now. I'd say about 60% through the first draft of part three. So that'll come out. It'll probably be the centerpiece, and then a prequel, and then the hopefully dramatic conclusion. Um, um, So that's the hope, that's the goal. And then at the same time, I'm also working on a nonfiction project that kind of takes some of the same, like similar themes, but kind of puts it in a context of, what is the brain, what is neuroscience and neurology, how is that changing because of the technology, and what are the ethical implications for society as we all kind of grapple and deal with like this coming revolution, with the brain.
Right, right. Fantastic. If someone wanted to get in touch with you, Sean, talk with you about your writing, talk with you about neurology in general, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, so I do have a website. It's called seanpauzauski.com. I've got kind of a long last name, but hopefully, um, that's not too heavy of a lift. But I have a newsletter and a mailing list. So if you signed up for that, you could get updates. You could also just look through the website and kind of see some of the different activities. I do travel and speak. I've got some speaking engagements coming up this fall, and yeah, always happy to connect with people who are interested, and yeah, just love to connect with readers and just the public in general.
Awesome. So, guys, I'll have all that in the show notes, including how to spell his last name, which is not that terribly cumbersome. So, definitely check him out there. Run out, grab yourself a copy of Stage of Fools. You're going to love it. I just found it fascinating, and I kept thinking about it over and over. So, the fact that you left me thinking, I think, is really good, Sean. And I want to thank you so much for being with me today.
Yeah, thank you, Terry. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Online for Authors, where I, Terry M. Brown, author of character-driven fiction and host of the podcast, introduce readers to characters they'd love to invite to lunch. Tune in next Tuesday for another podcast episode.